Hi, and welcome to another episode of the Cloud Architects podcast. And today, Chris and I have got a hugely interesting guest, and we're talking about security. And Chris, this is a longtime friend of yours that we're interviewing.
Yeah, longtime friend of the podcast too. We've worked together on and off over the years. Steve Ravel is our guest. He works at Microsoft now. I think he's a technical specialist in the healthcare space, focusing specifically on security. So one of our topics that we really like to talk about is security, and also it's topical with customers, I think. But I think there's also IT pros. There's a lot of confusion, right? Because I think we're crossing over. Where security is no longer just the responsibility of the security team, right, or the InfoSec team. I think security is everyone's responsibility now. But I think sometimes some of the concepts and things confuse people, and so we're trying to unconfuse people, debunk some of the myths as well. So really good conversation. Touching on EDR as a starting point. Endpoint detection and response. What does that even mean? Is it just cool antivirus, or with a new name, or is it something useful, and kind of just working up the chain, right, as to how all of these things plug in and tie together and really can kind of help with zero trust. And we talk about zero trust all the time, and I think everyone's sick of hearing the word zero trust, but it's important to talk about this and for us to change the mindset that we don't have a perimeter anymore, right? The traditional perimeter of a network with firewalls, the outside is bad, the inside is good. That concept is gone, and so I think it's important for us to start shifting our mind to understand a little bit more about let's treat everyone as an untrusted source, right? And do what we can, and so really interesting discussion. I certainly learned a lot about the inner workings and how everything kind of fits together, and some little nuggets I think about things that are coming, which I picked up on as well, with Defender for Identity and MCAS and things like that. So, and then ultimately the utopia is rolling all of the signaling up and all of the alerting up into something like Sentinel, right? And I think we, my opinion is that that is an aspiration for many organizations. I don't think it's unattainable. But certainly, it's not something that you just go. We have a SIM now, and now we have all of our stuff in one place. Like, I think it's something that you work up to. So definitely missed Warren today too, unfortunately. But myself and the ever smooth Nick. So yeah, we hope you enjoy the podcast, and we look forward to doing another one soon.
Yeah. So one of the things that's nice is that we managed to address the where do I start, where do I go, and where can I potentially end up without spending a fortune. And with that and a bunch of opinions from us, which is always necessary, we hope that you enjoy the show. Today we're talking to Steve, and Steve's been a friend of the podcast for a long time. Today we finally have him on the show. So Steve, welcome.
Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here.
It's definitely been something that's been in the works for, a while. I'm going to say at least 5 years, and conceived around a pizza table somewhere in Chicago at one point in time, having some deep
great
dish.
Pizza.
It was. So this has definitely been something we've been talking about for a while. So super excited to kind of finally have you on. And it's a big topic today, I think, a big topic. We'll see how deep we can get into it, but wanting to talk a little bit about EDR and Microsoft security and
the confusion around it.
Yeah, I think there is. I think there is confusion. I continue to have a lot of conversations with customers around Microsoft security. A lot of them are very interested in this, obviously very top of mind right now. You can't turn on the news or look at the media, let's say that, because we're not 1950 anymore, without seeing something about a breach. I actually got a letter in the mail yesterday from Denton County, Texas, letting me know that my their COVID registration database had been breached. And so all my data that I put in there to register for my COVID vaccine is now somewhere floating around the dark web.
And they sent you a letter.
They
Like
sent me a letter.
paper
Yeah.
letter.
Yeah,
Paper
Paper.
letter.
Yeah.
Yep. I received it because I don't live in Denton County anymore, and so I received this letter. I was like, well, "Why is Denton County sending me
I got a
anything?"
letter.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Wow.
That's the way. Yeah. So
We had this electronic security breach, and your electronic records were affected. But we're going to send you a piece of paper just to let you know.
yeah, and I think there is some legal. They have some legal obligation around that, right? That they have to like write to you. And
Yeah.
I'm trying to think of whether they may or may not have had my email address. I don't know for certain, but it's a non-stop thing. I mean, it happens. I think everyone at least once a month at this point is getting these kind of breach notifications, right? If
Mhm.
you know,
My
so
gosh.
it's a problem. So very top of mind. Very interested to kind of talk about it. So I think if we were to kind of jump right in, let's start off with EDR. It's something, it's like the new buzzword, right? And it has been for a while. Like everyone's talking about EDR and the DRs, right? Star DR. What is that? What are we talking about, Steve, when we talk about EDR and specifically? Like what does that mean to us in a Microsoft 365 context?
So in a Microsoft 365 context, it's really taking all of the telemetry that you're getting from various different pieces. So whether you have Defender for for Office 365 or Defender for Identity or Cloud App Security or any of these other things, or the actual Windows 10 devices, is taking that telemetry and that data and what's happening on that machine and getting it into a centralized area to be able to see what's going on that endpoint. So again, I say all of these other pieces, but it's really more focused on the endpoint because you have to pull that information in. You want to be able to know what's going on your endpoints. And so that's really what it's about. That whole idea of EDR is looking at what's going on at the endpoint level. Is there security threats is it vulnerable for anything? Is there any way that we can make this more secure? And how do we reduce the attack surface on those devices using what we currently have? And if we are breached, what do we do? How can we handle that? And what how do we investigate that? Where do we find that data that comes in? And so that's really what we're looking at when it comes to the EDR portion of, say, Defender for Endpoint. And if you go to, if you've got an ME5 or an E5, or if you go to, in fact, I think even there's some portions of it that are active on some E3 licensing, E3, A3, A5, for the academic licensing as well. But if you go to security.microsoft.com, that's when you start getting into that centralized portal where you start looking at the endpoint threat detection, as well as you start looking at some of the other threat around email and mail hygiene and things like that. And that's where that all culminates into a central repository that's taking a look at various different CVEs as for threats, as well as incorporating some of the MITRE attacks and information that we get from there, as well as allowing you to kind of test out some of those endpoints as well. So it's really more about detection and response to that detection. I mean, EDR, it's endpoint detection and response. I mean, that's what it is. But it's really getting that telemetry from those Windows devices and knowing what's going on them.
So just a little bit more in depth than antivirus, right? Because,
absolutely.
And I think that was gonna be my next question is we're talking about a Defender for Endpoint, but when I just have a regular Windows 10 PC, I have Defender on a PC as well, right? So
it's free.
And it's free. So what's the difference here? Are we talking about like getting an extra console with centralized reporting, or is there a little bit more to it than just that?
It's a little more to it than just that, but you're correct. Every Windows 10 machine has that Defender in it. And one thing I like to point out is that it's not a client. You can't uninstall it. It's kernel level. It's part of the OS. So it's not dragging down the resources on that machine. It's not an extra client that's getting in there. And in fact, if you do install an extra AV client, that defender just goes into passive mode. It doesn't turn off. It just goes into passive mode. And part of that whole idea of that passive mode is that it still has that backup level in case that client, in case one of the other AVs installed doesn't get it. But really what it is at that point in time, if you're looking at AV, I mean, it's scanning, you're protecting, you're looking for viruses. The EDR is looking at more than that. It's looking at software inventory, software vulnerability, update levels. It's looking at telemetry coming in, network information coming into that device, and looking for anomalies based off of the trillions of signals that we know we're looking for. And so it's really not. It's like antivirus and more. So that endpoint protection is always there. And we can utilize that endpoint protection to react to a potential breach. But that EDR is really coming in to let us know what's going on specifically on that machine. That makes sense. Yeah, and that defender for endpoint on the machine, I believe it's called next gen protection. I think this is how they're starting to brand it now. It's the defender on the machine. It's the next gen protection, and that piece is where we start getting into. If you have EDR, you have an incident. That's where it can start the process of locking things down, preventing breaches, automatically responding. And that's where we get into that response, that if it sees a breach, it can automatically respond, utilizing its connection and everything that you have on there. If you want to be proactive, you can put in attack surface reduction rules. And those attack surface reduction rules that's where you get into like Intune and having to push those policies down. But once those rules are in place, it means that the EDR response has to do less because there's potentially no breach. You're already reducing the attack surface.
So let me ask this.
Mm-hmm.
We've got this thing in the industry, which is the long tail of previous best practices.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't actually matter if we're talking about Exchange or SQL or endpoint, or even how do we protect ourselves? And we had a customer, a net new customer that came to us the other day, and they were recovering from ransomware. And in part of their post-breach analysis, it was pointed out to them that they were running AV on their servers, and they were only using passwords without any kind of a second factor. And
Okay.
we go, what? And that sounds like how we did security in the 90s. And to be fair, that is how we did security in the 90s. And many businesses, small businesses, medium businesses, are still in that same boat because they don't see a reason. Why should that change? Why is this? Where is the clear and present danger that's forcing me to change? And I hear you, Steve, and it sounds great, but to me, it sounds like marketing buzzwords, right? So
Mm-hmm.
I've got my endpoint security because I'm running my antivirus on my servers, and I got passwords on my routers, and I have passwords for my users. So why do I need more security from Microsoft?
So I think you're right. That does kind of come into a legacy mindset. I've got these passwords. I've got all of this information. But the legacy mindset was also, I don't know if I want to deploy these updates because these updates might break the legacy application that I have. And that whole idea, and of not doing updates, security updates, critical updates, things like that. That's where you start getting into that trouble. The mindset around this is that there are so many attacks coming so often, and there's so many different ways that they're coming in, that the assumption is that you have to assume that you're going to be breached or you're breached. And that's the whole idea of zero trust, is that you want to know what's going on in your machines. And you can keep your AV on those machines, but if you don't have that telemetry of every single little last piece from that machine, then you'll never know where or what happened. You'll never be alerted. If it gets by that AV, if your AV is just, a week out of definitions, then you're putting yourself at risk. And I think the idea around this is that the more information that we can have pull in, the faster we can react to be able to prevent damage and or automatically say, hey, this is a breach that we saw coming in and we stopped it.
Aren't you saying, though, Steve, that if I'm an IT manager or an IT director who's responsible for their security shop, aren't you saying that a lot of the security requirements that are out there to defend ourselves against attacks that are so advanced that we, by default, the fence that we're building around our houses just can't stop the bulldozer that's out there, right? So I've got this white picket fence, and it used to work, but the bulldozers have become bigger. Do I have any kind of line of defense if I don't partner with a Microsoft or another big gorilla in the room from a security point of view? Am I defenseless?
That's a tough question. Quite honestly, if you're not looking, I mean, that's a tough question. Are you defenseless? I mean, quite honestly, if you're not partnering with someone, you certainly don't have the defenses that you could.
I think also there's the partnering piece, but then there's also the change of mindset, right? And I think, Steve, you mentioned a few things that I've certainly run into a bunch. Updates. If you do nothing else, update your stuff. You can't today live in a world where you're N-2 anymore. Like I know, large organizations have always kind of had this thing, you know what, we'll let other people test it and we'll let them shake it out, and we'll always be N-1. And or if we're an exchange and we're hybrid, N-2 is what the minimum we need to be supported. Hey, supportability and being secure are two different things, and you cannot operate in an environment anymore, exchange or other, right? We know exchange has taken a lot of beating this year. You cannot operate. It's just insane. So if you do nothing else, you've got to update, right? Keep that stuff up to date. So there's that change of mindset for one, right? Is make sure that you can get the stuff done. Your environment's very large. You have all these servers to patch. I understand that. Figure it out. Automation is there, right? We have all of these things that we can do to make this better. You don't have to be living in 1990 anymore. But I think the other part of this is you also have to think about how you change the way you think about security. It's not a matter of saying, well, we've bought this product, it's deployed, we're good. That's not how this works anymore, right? There is this partnership concept. But I also think you need to be looking at, what Gartner is saying, not Gartner, what NIST is saying about controls, right? You need to be auditing yourself. Even if you don't care about the certification, the compliance cert that comes with it, not every business needs to be ISO, blah, 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 right? But take that information. It's freely available in most cases. Use those controls to have a look at, well, you know what, do I have multi-factor on some of my important services, right? I'm going through an exercise like this with a customer at the moment, and I can't obviously talk about it too much, but there's a perception that in order for us to get to this like utopia of security, we have to go and buy all of this stuff. And obviously, the bigger your budget, as with anything, the bigger your budget, the better or the easier it could potentially be. But it doesn't mean that you can't do anything. You have to go and start in these little baby steps. Updating your stuff, that's very important. Looking at what's out in the market, like you can't, we've all read about active threats and ransomware that target traditional AV, right? Because, well, it goes into the registry and it just nukes the start, right? And it does nothing until weeks later. Because we've got to remember too, Hollywood portrays the bad guy, bad actors, as these guys with hoodies, sitting in the dark, right? Which, up until now,
Some of them are.
well,
yeah, some of them,
but depending on the day, that could be me also, right?
Yeah.
I love sitting in the dark. I do it all the time.
Absolutely.
That's how, but Hollywood portrays these as like people who, like, it's seconds, like they're acting instantly, and they're breaching, and they're getting in, they're getting out, and they're nuking logs, and they're gone. That's not the reality, people. These bad actors are spending weeks reconning your environment. They're taking a long time. When they get in, they're not even acting. I did a compromise assessment just recently. The bad actor had been in the environment for 3 weeks before they did anything. 3 weeks. And I think that's a short period of time, right? So the stuff takes a while. And so when you don't have if you don't have something, I think kernel level, anything kernel level that cannot just be nuked out of the registry or the service stopped is obviously there's some benefit to that. But when you have something that's reporting the telemetry on the machine and is looking out for abnormalities, right? That's a really, really good thing to have. Now, the next problem becomes you have 10,000 machines in your fleet, and you have the central repository of 10,000 times 10,000 logs every hour. You've got to be able to pass that stuff in an easy to digest way, because otherwise it just becomes noise. And then we see, what we used to see back in the old days of MOM, right? Microsoft Operations Manager, where people just start turning stuff off because there's just too many alerts, right? So
I think we still have some of that. So, say you enable all of Microsoft security capabilities. You got Defender for Endpoint on your DCs looking for sideways movement and for pass the hash and golden ticket and stuff like that. You've got Defender for Office 365 looking for malware. You've got Defender, you've got Cloud App Security, and you've got Defender for Endpoint all coming in. You still have to tune it. You still have to make sure. But what's happening now is that if an incident comes in, if it's just an alert, it's just an alert. If it's a high level alert, you'll get alerted on that. But if it's just an alert, it's just an alert. But if it becomes an incident and then concatenates all of those telemetry data. So maybe they came in via MCAS, or maybe they came in via an email, and then they got access via a log on a Win 10 machine, and then they moved sideways. So all of that stuff now comes into a central location where Microsoft has said, we have seen this actor come in. He came in through malware. He jumped over from this machine to this machine to this machine. He got elevated access. He did pass the hash, and then he did these 5 things. Getting that all together in the traditional, in the legacy world, is almost impossible, because you got to get logs from 5 different places. You got to get your AV logs. You got to get your proof point. You've got to get all of that different information. You've got to get that all together. And I think what I'm seeing, and I worked at a Microsoft partner for many years, and I am, I don't consider myself a fanboy. I run Linux servers. I often run Ubuntu.
Warren would have been beside himself right now.
Yeah. But what I'm seeing what they've done here is completely different than anybody else has done. I mean, the closest thing that has come to it, and the biggest thing has been the conglomerate of kind of security groups that got together and said, hey, we're all 5 separate different companies, but now you can buy this and have this bundled of the AV and the IDM and all of those different things. But Microsoft already has all of that, and they're already, like you said, whether you like Gartner or not, they're already in the upper right quadrant for almost everything when it comes to security level. So it's just getting more and more secure based off of the amount of money they're putting into security, as well as the telemetry they get. Nobody else can get that level of telemetry.
And I think that's a really good point, right? Because we've historically, and to Nick's, to use Nick's phrasing, the long tail of previous best practices, right? If I was responsible for purchasing product at a large organization, I'd be going after the best of breed solutions, right? I'd be going to the best, what was it, would be considered the best AV vendor, and I'd go buy their thing. Then I'd go to the best spam, vendor, and I'd go buy their thing. Sometimes they were the same, sometimes they were not. We didn't care. But we really should start looking at this more as like a best in platform model now, where if you do have all your eggs in one basket, there's actually some benefit to that now, right? Because it's, we can reuse all of those security signals and make better decisions across the entire platform. And we've long since on this show said one of Microsoft's strongest and biggest benefits in the marketplace today is Azure AD. Because Azure AD is the thing that ties everything else together, right? If you know the identity and you control the identity, and it's an extension of your identities on premises, so we've already got that piece. Now everything we can look at what's happening with that identity on logon, and then correlate that to signaling we're getting from the endpoint. How powerful is that, and how can any vendor compete with that?
Well, yeah, I mean, exactly. If you start looking at that, I mean, we talk about a lot of this stuff. We talk about, EDR and attack surface reduction and stuff like that. But you're right. Identity is that core, and that's where that zero trust starts. When you're dealing with like Azure AD, and especially when you deal with like identity protection, where it's taking your password hashes and verifying them across the dark web and saying, oh, this user's been compromised. We got to go ahead and shut his machine down or force MFA on everything. Identity is 100% the first line of defense. And like they said, enabling MFA will stop 99% of most identity breaches. But if something gets through, if MFA is not there, then or if someone goes out to a site and torrents down something, or downloads something, and hey, this is an interesting script, I'm just going to go ahead and double click it, and boom, it goes. If there's something embedded in a Word document or something like that, you want to make sure that if the identity is not in play, you're at least saying, I know this identity opened this file, and this file now jumped around. So now I know kind of where it started, and now I can start tracking that back and say, okay, this is the user that started it. Let's lock them down. Let's force MFA on them, or let's do what we need to do there. And then we can chase the subsequent users. We can hunt them. And that's the whole idea of the threat hunting in the security center within Microsoft as well, is hunting across that telemetry that you have.
That sounds a lot like sounds like COVID contact tracing in Australia.
They
will hunt you down and lock you up.
That's exactly what it is.
So you mentioned something you mentioned before. Sorry, Nick. You look like you're getting very cold, by the way, Nick. It looks like it's pretty cold in Cape Town.
It's winter on my side of the world. And when you're finished, I have a semi-unfair question for Steve, because he looks very comfortable at the moment, and I think we should do something about that.
What I was going to ask was, so you had mentioned Intune, and you'd also mentioned MCAS, right? So I'm curious, kind of a two-parter on the question. This is a Nick question, two-parter. Part one, what are the requirements for Intune as far as being able to deploy Defender, right, for endpoint? Like, do you have to use one? Are they mutually exclusive, or do you have to go with both of them together? And then the second part of this is more, how does MCAS kind of fit into this, right? Because MCAS is not on the device, and we're looking at those connections to the cloud, right? And how can we leverage MCAS to make our devices more secure?
So first and foremost, Intune, if you get into doing attack surface reduction rules and policies and things like that, and managing the actual endpoint protection, that next gen protection on those Win 10 machines, Intune is obviously going to be where you want to do that. It doesn't stop you. You can continue to use that endpoint protection. And I believe that there's group policies and things you can do with Microsoft Endpoint Config Man, the old SCCM on premise, co-manage, that sort of stuff. You can control that endpoint protection on those Windows 10 machines that way. But it's just in Intune, it makes it very easy. You don't have to have the device enrolled in Intune to get that EDR capability. And in fact, if you're doing Windows 10 or even the servers or down level servers or even Linux servers or Mac machines, you absolutely can just enroll them to start getting that telemetry. So, you don't have to be using that endpoint protection to be able to get that telemetry. Again, like I said, you could have a trend endpoint installed, and you could still enroll that device into the endpoint protection EDR portion, get that telemetry, and because that endpoint protection is in passive mode, if something gets through trend, then that endpoint protection has the ability to block, and it has the ability to isolate those machines and allow you to kind of get in and manage that. So do you need Intune? You don't, but it does make it easier for that level of protection. It's just a script that you run. You could push it out with GPO. You could push it out with just a standard psexec command. You can remotely deploy the script on whatever machines you want. When it comes to MCAS, though, we're getting telemetry from that, and MCAS is going to be the repository for Defender for Identity at some point as well. They've already started the process of taking Defender for Identity, which is the old Advanced Threat Analytics, and bringing that telemetry data into MCAS as well. But MCAS is where you can ensure that any of your cloud, including the 365 stack, but including Salesforce and all of those different SaaS-based applications, you're monitoring exactly what they do, and it becomes that forward proxy. So users are going through that, and then everything they're doing in that cloud is monitored. And then that MCAS has the ability to plug in for a variety of things. When it comes to compliance, you have the ability to do DLP. You could do endpoint DLP. You have the ability to do a variety of things there. But that's where the Azure AD comes into play. So if you're outside of a network, if you have conditional access, you can create conditional access policies that force over that forward proxy to make sure that anything that you're doing inside of that SaaS app is going through the cloud app security, going through that CASB. And you can tie it to, again, that identity protection and say, if this is a threat risk, or if this is a impossible travel, or if this user has been compromised, we are going to let them in with MFA, but they're only going to get read-only to Salesforce. They're not going to get anything else. So when it comes to that, it's that MCAS piece. All of that telemetry still goes into that EDR for threat hunting to try to find out what potential bad actors might have done, or to try to stop that. But that MCAS piece is very powerful in making sure that any SaaS-based application that they're accessing is monitored and controlled. The best part about it, especially when you start getting into endpoint, is you can sanction and unsanction apps and URLs. So if someone's going to Gmail, I can unsanction Gmail, and at that endpoint level, it will prevent them from going to Gmail. So I can sanction AWS, and they can get into that. And if I unsanction it, it goes away. They don't have the ability to access and get into those SaaS-based apps. And that actually is controlled and pushed down to that endpoint. It's the endpoint that blocks it. It's not that forward or reverse proxy. So, at that point in time, if your endpoint is in and it's enrolled and it's set up with MCAS and it's in Intune, you have the ability to do a lot more granular controls on what people can and can't do and can and can't open. And so that's where you get into that shadow IT blocking and making sure that you're not letting people get to some of those things.
So it occurs to me that would be a useful tool as far as a response to some sort of breach as well, right? If you're known or if you're able to detect that there is something going on the endpoints, and these endpoints are now starting to, phone home to some sort of command and control, you could block that straight away and just cut it off so that they're no longer phoning home. So that seems like that could be a pretty useful tool too.
Yeah, absolutely. You can put in, specific URLs, things like that. But the other piece that around that is when you get back into that security. If they're Windows 10 and they're a part of that security center and they've been enrolled within Defender for Endpoint in the EDR, if you know of the specific machine that is the source for that bad actor and everything else seems okay, you can isolate it. And that remote isolation basically locks down all network communication except for you coming in and getting in and doing, remote connectivity via that Defender for Endpoint console, that security console, and running packages to get all of the data from there, and or communicating directly with that user. You can have teams able to work, but nothing else. Nothing. It's absolutely isolated at that point. So that's one of the powerful things that you can do at that level as well. That has to be kind of more of a modern OS, the Windows 10 base kernel and up. That gives you that capability.
That's probably, I can imagine with, work from home, those types of capabilities are pretty important because you can't just send someone over to the desk right now, right? Or at least not very easily. But I wonder how many organizations are really set up for that type of thing. Interestingly, though, too, we're talking, Windows 10 and server, but so I think Server 2022 came out last week, was it? Which is interesting. And we're seeing, obviously, Windows 11. I think the first ISO release is out now, so lots of change happening. Interesting.
Yeah, and lots of change happening, but a lot of the security capabilities, like from starting with Win 10, that level of kernel, parts of 2016 you have to enable that, but 2019 server and above have that advanced protection. And you can deploy ASR capabilities. Now, there's not a centralized way to do it unless you're using SCCM on servers. Windows 10 endpoints, you have the ability to obviously do it with Intune. But yeah, as we start looking at that, it's more and more integrated, and it's sending more and more telemetry to prevent, again, these ransomware, these types of attacks, this infiltration.
Nick,
So
you had a question.
I actually have a question for both of you. And I want to throw this at the both of you because, Chris, you are a CCIE and Stephen, you are a security vendor. And the question is that the three of us are very comfortable with Zero Trust as a framework, understanding that it is a framework. And originally it was a Forrester thing. Oh, I apologize. My world is ringing. Let me just put down on that. So originally it was a Forrester thing, and Microsoft has an implementation of that, and we're comfortable with that. And Microsoft's implementation is around identity, and we still have the preservation of principles like network segmentation because of conditional access, as well as other mechanisms like physical mechanisms within Azure that we can also use for infrastructure. But staying with modern workplace and what we're achieving from a security point of view, is there not a danger that we have subscribed to a methodology of defense and that our attackers can choose not to subscribe to that same methodology and just attack using a different method and methodology? So we're not, Einstein said that you can't solve a problem with the same thinking that caused it. So if I'm an attacker, I could just look at everything that Zero Trust defends, and these are great principles, right? So we've got MITRE as a framework to resolve attacks, and we can assume that there's horizontal movement, so we'll look for that. But we've seen some incredible attacks that have happened that we could not necessarily have prevented. We found them, and that's great. But if we look at the previous OEMs and very large software companies who make software for other companies like SolarWinds, the SolarWinds breach was just genius. That completely circumvented, arguably, what we are trying to achieve with Zero Trust.
I don't necessarily agree with that, because I think the whole premise of Zero Trust is that you have to always verify everything, right? So never trust, always verify. And I think that if you were to uphold those principles on absolutely everything, so absolutely every connection inbound, and let's be real, how many organizations today can say we're 100% at the end of our zero trust journey. I don't think anyone
I know
can.
no
Right?
one.
Exactly.
Not a single customer.
But ultimately, if you were to stay true to, to use Microsoft terminology, that North Star of what zero trust is, right? I think it probably could have circumvented that. I think the problem is that we're always going to find that convenience is going to be the the undoer or the evildoer, and is going to be the thing that kind of helps attackers come in, because we're gonna secure the things again that we think are going to be targets, but there's always going to be that little back door that we have this vendor that's doing this thing for us, and their guys can't have accounts in our environment, or we're not going to allow, they don't want to have to multi-factor every time there's always going to be, and it's always going to be a human thing, right? And so I know that Steve early on when we were talking here talked about OCM and sort of adoption and change management and stuff like that. And I think that's where that part becomes very important, because no level of technology, it doesn't matter how sophisticated, it doesn't matter how big your budget, is ever going to solve the human element. You're going to have to bring the users along on this journey, right?
Social engineering is always going to be number one, and social hacking is always going to be always going to be the potential to get through on things. And I think you bring up a good point. We're seeing that they're no longer attacking individuals with MFA, and we've got smart links, and we've got remote detonation of attachments, and so they're looking at other ways in, like SolarWinds. But once they get in, they got to move sideways. They got to do something. Once they get down onto a client that's within an Azure data center, and they start jumping to another one, that's where we getting that telemetry and making sure. And that's while zero trust starts at the end user and making sure that we're verifying that, the zero trust also it makes the assumption that you've been breached. And so making sure where it is and you're alerted early is a huge part of that zero trust, is ensuring you're getting that telemetry. So as long as we're getting all the telemetry, we're going to see all of those things. There might be a breach, but zero trust, it wasn't from an identity, it wasn't from a user, it was from someone coming in. We saw it, we mitigated it, and the damage was minimal. And
I think
that's all that.
We've seen wildly sophisticated attacks recently, and we've seen actors using like exploit chains of like 3 or 4 different 0 days to do the thing they're looking to do, right? But not all of them are like that. Very often these things are opportunity, right? And so look at the Colonial Pipeline attack that happened, when was it, earlier this year, right, when they shut down the pipeline to the part of the US. That the way they got in was credential reuse with no MFA, right? They found the VPN. I believe it was a VPN concentrator login on the dark web. There was no MFA on it. That's we've been preaching that stuff for years. So that stuff is simple, right? And now MFA is not necessarily up to the end user, I guess. I'm not aware. I've never worked with customers who give the user the option: do you want MFA or not? Right? Usually, it's mandated, or if it's not there, it's because the organization isn't mature enough to get there yet, and that happens. Like we see that. But credential reuse, 100% is an end user training and awareness thing, right? And you solve that through change management, awareness programs, helping users understand the dangers of, and I think Colonial Pipeline is like the case in point now of the danger of credential reuse, right? But I also, have any of you, this is just for my own interest sake, and because Nick and I were talking about password managers earlier in the week. Any of you worked with customers who have password managers for regular users? I'm not talking that most IT departments have some form of password manager, right? Where they store passwords, important stuff. I'm talking like end users. Like you join an organization, as Joey in accounting, and on your first day or your first week of sort of onboarding, you get access to a password manager that has a vault for your personal stuff and a vault for corporate stuff that is shared in your team. Have any of you come across clients that work in that way? Because I haven't.
Mm-mm.
We do this internally, but it's because we understand the risk of credential leak and the kind of risk that it opens us up as a professional services organization. And we use third-party vaults with strong encryption and controls in place and that type of thing. And getting in there and realizing the kind of treasure trove that I sit on, for example, for me to do estate planning, as an example, just in my personal right.
Yeah.
I had to figure out, how do I do personal estate planning so that people around me could do banking in case I die, that type of thing. So having to put that somewhere and then figuring out how to make that secure made my passwords into sentences that I could communicate and write down somebody securely on a piece of paper. Very much like if you getting into the Bitcoin world, and you got to write that password down somewhere on a piece of paper so it physically can't be breached, right, and lock it up in a secure place. But coming back to customers, I find it's very difficult to get past that. Why should I do it? I seem to be okay. I seem to be safe. And aren't you being a bit paranoid about this? Until there's a breach, and then often we want to fix just enough to get past that breach, so that breach isn't repeatable. But I don't want to be inconvenienced by having this whole security mindset, because it's hard work. It's a different way of thinking. I've got to train my users. And this is, I think, where we get to Steve's point, where if we have that partner on our side that automates so much of that, where I can take passwords away from users, and I can MFA as part of a transparent workflow, so I'm passwordless. So now I don't have to do password education. And my users, all of their links are now safe. Every link that gets to me via Teams or via an email. I had a phishing email today that appeared to come from my bank, and I looked at it, and the mail was crafted nearly perfectly up until I hovered over the URL, and it was a shortened URL. So I took it into a safe browser and I detonated it, and the safe links actually said, this is a malicious link. So I knew my accounting staff would have been safe, and they would have been rescued by safe links coming in. So I think there's an awful lot that automation does for us and can do for us. But the other side of the coin, where you say, do customers do this? Customers also look at this stuff and say, oh, I need an E5 or I need an M365 E5. That's a lot of money to get all the toys. And what's the minimum toys I need to get to feel safe enough that I've done the right thing and that I'm probably not going to get breached? And honestly, I don't have an answer to that.
See, I think my response to that usually is that it's a journey, right? And yes. I think Martina Grom made this point also when we talked to her and Tony a few weeks ago. Every organization is going to be in a different level of maturity when it comes to some of this stuff, right?
Yeah.
You're going to have some organizations who get the MFA thing, and everyone has MFA across everything. But then when it comes to data security, they're nowhere, right? And so when you're an organization and you're sitting and you're going, okay, well, we want to secure our IP now, right? And I work with companies like this all the time, manufacturing, etc. We want to secure our IP. I'm going to go out and buy like the highest SKU because that gives me all the features. My response is always, look, that's great that you have the budget to do that, but where are you now, right? Do you have data classification? Do you know what your data is and where it is? Well, no. I was like, you need to start there. You don't need an M5 E5 to start with data classification. Start at that level, get that stuff in place, get your users thinking about using classification labels and sensitivity labels and all of that stuff. And then when you want to start getting to a little bit more of an advanced functionality, once the organization is on board, then you start bringing in some of the automation and some of the higher end SKUs. But I feel like there's this, again, it's just this old school tendency of saying, the more money we throw at a problem, the quicker the problem's going to go away. A lot of these problems are not technology problems anymore. They're change problems, they're cultural problems, they're user problems that we need to look at it a little bit of a different way. So,
and I think if we start looking at the cost level of things, you start looking at the hard and soft costs. I mean, sure, yes, an ME5 or an EMS E5, or an EMS E5 plus compliance. Yeah, it can get pricey. I mean, I think the retail on an ME5 is $57 right now.
Well, and then in March of 2022. It's going up.
E3s. E3s. I think E5s are
E5 is not.
But if you look at the soft cost being, the ability to automate a lot of the response and making sure that you're not chasing these things down, that's one thing. That's hard to quantify soft costs. But if you start looking at the competitor products that you have in there that you're already paying for, if you have a different MCAS, if you have a different EDR solution, if you have a different compliance solution, if you have all of those things and you start adding that all up plus your E3 that you're getting, it then starts getting to a point where it's like, yeah, I mean, I could buy this bundle and I could have everything. But to Chris's point, it's a journey, and it's really hard to go all in immediately. It is a journey, and it is about, I mean, that's why you have phishing campaigns and within the Defender for Office 365 to be able to kind of test and train your users that, hey, just be a little more vigilant. And that's why you have a lot of that stuff.
And even that's like you're gonna if you're really good, you're gonna get to a point where that tool is no longer providing value because your users are so well trained that you can't trick them enough with that tool, right? And at that point, then you have to say, okay, well, hang on, maybe I need to go and look at some other thing in the market where I can do some more advanced. Because, I always look at the way Microsoft does things is this sort of 80-20 breakdown, right? They really want to be everything for 80% of the market, but there's always going to be 20% of organizations where, you know what I mean? Maybe the tool is a little lightweight for what they need, and so you can step that up. So I think. I mean, it's great. You need to start somewhere, though, right? You can't just go from zero to hero. And then the other risk there, and this is, I think, where our friends at eNow do really well, is helping customers identify that wastage. Because when you go in and you just go and spend money on licenses, but you're not actually using any of that stuff, then the next year comes around for your renewal. You're on the journey to actually starting to make use of some of these licenses, but you haven't quite got there yet. Right? Because you're just like, oh, well, I have them, I'll use them. But when the bean counters come around next year, they go, well, hang on, you didn't use any of the stuff. Why do you want to renew it? That conversation is a lot harder than saying, well, you know what? Year one, we made absolutely all the use of everything that we had. Look at the great benefits that it's provided the organization. We haven't, had any breaches, blah, 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 blah. We now want to up because we want to get some, more advanced functionality. I think the conversation is much easier to have than like, like we didn't use half the stuff we have.
And that's
go on, Steve.
Sorry. I was just gonna say that's a huge reason why you look at a lot of partners, a lot of services, consulting partners, and Microsoft itself, who are looking to make sure that you're getting the value out of it. If you bought an E5 or if you bought an E3, they want to make sure that you're utilizing that, because ultimately it's going to make you more secure. But they want to make sure you're doing it right too.
So we've talked about literally a family of disciplines and products and things that we could be doing, and various different approaches. And again, I want to direct the two of you, because you've got the luxury of an enterprise mindset, enterprise customers. However, we also have customers that are net new coming into the ecosystem. So I've never engaged with Microsoft as a security vendor before. I'm taking identity from Microsoft. So imagine we've got a customer who comes over from Google or another ecosystem or even another security vendor. What are the 2 or 3 things that we care the most about that would give a customer a running start, and understanding that there's a journey? But where do we get that warm, fuzzy glow of, I have a good start? And obviously, if we don't start with identity and MFA, I don't think we've got a start of a conversation. So I'm going to qualify that one as the first one, right? But then let me hand over to you two and say, okay, I've managed to fight with my users. I've got MFA on everything. What do I do next?
I mean, you've got MFA on everything, so you're there. If you've got your mailboxes in Office 365, I think the next thing you're looking at is securing the data within Office 365. So you're looking at kind of the anti-phishing, the safe links, the safe attachments. I think that's the next simple one. And when you get into attack simulation and helping train those users, and I think any company from 25 users up to multiple thousands of users are going to see the advantages in that. I think that's the next step, because if you get in via MFA, you can always mess things up by clicking on a bad link or open a bad attachment.
Yeah.
So that's that start. And then I think from there, you start looking at maintaining the endpoint that those users are on. And at least that's just my perspective, making sure that those endpoints are safe, whether it means that they're updated, or you've gone through and looked at all the security risks and all the software inventory that Defender for Endpoint, if that EDR, it's going to do a full software inventory, and you're going to see Adobe's out of it's out of support. You got to do an update here. So doing that and making sure what your endpoints are looking at and getting telemetry around that, I think is the next step, because that's going to make it secure.
I agree with that. I think it's good. You got to take the users on the journey, right? And you got to be protecting the data. But I would add, on the data protection side, depending on what your organization does, data security is probably also really, really important, right? Starting to look at classification and sensitivity and stuff, but that's not as important for every organization. I spoke to a customer a little while ago who do Nick might know these guys. They're in agri. They do they grow fruit and things like that all around the world. And we were talking about sensitive data and data security. And well, we're farmers. Like, we don't have anything. Now, I don't know that this is necessarily 100% true, but the point he made was, we're farmers. If someone wants to take our data, they can take our data. They're gonna, understand soil samples and fertilizer mixtures and stuff like that. He was like, that stuff's not trade secrets, right? Whereas I have other customers who have, very, very highly sensitive formulas for things that they've developed as proprietary, IP. Yeah, that you want to protect that stuff.
Does the farmer need exact data match, where you upload a list of everything that and it stops at at that exact data match? Probably not. But understanding data exfiltration, insider risk, that sort of stuff, I think that's always beneficial for anybody. And I think that you make a good point with that. That kind of the compliance side of things, making sure that where your data is, at least, and who has access to it. And if you don't want him to have access to it, or to be able to put it up into their own Dropbox account, you can stop that.
Yep. And then I think the endpoint is great. Sorry, Nick. The last point I wanted to make here is, when we talk about compliance and sort of risk management, and I think this is going to definitely be a conversation for a different episode, though, is starting to look at vendor risk management, because that is becoming very important these days. Because, as I said at the top of the episode, anyone is going to get breached at any point these days, and you can't, if someone has your data, you need to also be doing some sort of due diligence into how they keep records, right? So that you can be as secure as possible, but you're doing business with someone who doesn't care. Not the best idea.
It's true. It's true. I just want to point out that both of you had wonderful strategies and very, very implementable. However, neither one of you said at which point do we pause and look at which console, so that I get an all-up view of something without necessarily having to do a Sentinel investment, because I'm going to start with an MFA journey. And to be fair, I can see how many users are MFA'd or not MFA'd without having to go to a complicated console. And then I add, or let's just say I stop at safe links, but then from a surfacing of how awesome my protection point of view is, and obviously there's some maturity there as well, there's consoles I can look at that I can also then grow into other things. I don't need necessarily to have a Sentinel at that point. I might want to have a compliance dashboard or a risk dashboard that I'm looking at inside my tenant. And that's also good enough at that stage, understanding that we're in a journey, and maybe you are going to go down the road of SOC SIEM. Maybe you're just going to go SIEM, and maybe you don't need, or at some stage can't afford, advanced telemetry, interpolation, and being able to correlate things across multiple data sources. But at minimum, you want to be able to have a place that you look at something that says, I have alerts, I have something that comes to me, and I need to know how good or badly I'm doing, because there's no point in security being a black box and I'm assuming that I'm secure without some kind of a surfacing of that information.
So I definitely agree with the thinking there that, when you start having all of this alerting and everything, it has to go somewhere, right? It has to go somewhere that can make intelligent decisions about it and kind of help cut down on the noise. I also think that when you start talking about Sentinel, you're stepping to a level where you need dedicated people who do only that thing. And I know that people are going to disagree with me here, but I don't think that you can make the most use of a platform like Splunk or Logarithm or Sentinel or anything like that unless you have security-focused, security-minded people, and their job is to maintain and respond to alerts in that platform. A lot of organizations, like we know the jack of all trade approach that a lot of organizations have, right? Hey, you're doing Exchange Online while you're also doing Teams now and MFA. We've got the Sentinel thing, so we're gonna give that to you as well. I don't believe that Sentinel skill set and sort of thinking fits with someone who isn't focused on it. I think it's to get the most value, and I realize this is going to be a controversial opinion, but just based on my experience working with customers who have tried this and done this and stuff like that, I just don't think it works until.
I think when you're dealing with companies that aren't going into Sentinel, you've got a lot of those portals, and it's not all in one. And I think that it seems like that it's shifting that way to the security.microsoft.com to that portal. But you look at your compliance portal, you look at your security portal, you look at all of these different things. They're going to give you that secure score. And that secure score, I think, is a pretty good indicator of what you've implemented to make sure you're secure, or your compliance score. I think those are pretty good areas, especially when you're looking at maybe a smaller company that doesn't have that dedicated piece. It's going to show you, your score is this. Click here to see what else you could do to raise that score. So MFA is enabled, but there might be some other things. You haven't deployed the latest patch, so your score is not going to be as high. So you need to go do that. And I think that for those jack of all trades gives you that centralized location, at least for the endpoints, at least for Office 365 Defender, for that mail hygiene and the compliance side of things. It is 3 right now, but it is, once you get to that portal, it does give you a pretty good indication of the health of your business at that time. When you get into Sentinel, obviously you can start bringing in other telemetry to be able to really do that. And that's where you start getting into, I kind of agree with you a bit, Chris. The other thought would be potentially a professional services person who comes in once a month. Maybe you don't necessarily need that, a full-time person, but if you're a smaller organization, you take all of that information that you get from the security portal, the Defender for Endpoint, and that can dump into Sentinel, with a connector. And that dumping of that data is not going to cost anybody anything. So people can get an idea of what that is. So there's a limited capability. You're not going to be able to have years upon years of Defender for Endpoint data, but you can take that Defender for Endpoint data, get it into Sentinel. People can start messing around with that, see what that looks like. But I think you're right, Nick. If you do that and then you start pulling in firewall logs, you start pulling router logs, you start pulling in SAN logs, you start pulling all of this stuff in. You start connecting in Azure VMs, you connect out to AWS, you pull in the telemetry from those VMs into one Sentinel. You then can start creating those workbooks that create that nice dashboard for an overall health for your organization. And then you can start creating playbooks and automation around if there's a breach based off of that. So you can start adding that automation in, and again, it gives you the capability to be able to say, hey, this machine's not necessarily secure. Do you want us to go fix it? Or this database that you have in Azure isn't secure. That does kind of get into larger organizations. I think for some of the smaller ones, the security pieces and the portals that you have there are a good first start as you grow.
Again, yeah, and I think that just kind of reaffirms it's a journey, right? You can't don't bite off everything in one bite. You got to kind of piecemeal this and just take snack-sized bites till you get to the end. I think that makes a lot of sense. Well, you know what? I think this is one of those topics where we could keep talking all day, but I know that we've all got things to get on with as well. So, Steve, thank you very much for finally coming on the show. even though this wasn't, the delay hasn't necessarily been on anyone's side, but I'm glad we managed to finally get this pulled together.
Absolutely.
We always like to kind of ask as we sort of close off, is there anything you want to plug, any resources you think that are super important that viewers and listeners need to go and kind of check out, and how do you want to be found, social media, things like that?
Well, you got my Twitter handle up there. It's not as professional as either of your guys' Twitter handles, so you got my Twitter handle up there. You can get me there. And at this point in time, there's it's not anything. I work for Microsoft, so I think I've been plugging Microsoft for probably the last hour and 20 minutes, and I'm a firm believer in that. So if it's not Microsoft, these paper sculptures here, paper craft world, they're fantastic. That's been my my COVID hobby is
Nice.
folding paper, keeping my hands busy. So.
Yeah, fair
That's
enough.
amazing.
I was wondering about those. Actually, I did see them back there. So I was like, what is that? Interesting.
Yes.
If, it's a pity you don't have if Warren was here and you had Batman somewhere, he'd be
Batman.
well, Superman. I forget. Anyway, thank you once again for your time, man. Really appreciate it. This was a great conversation, and we'll just have to kind of pick up where we left off. I think in another episode.
I mean, yeah. I'm hopefully I'm fun enough to talk to, and you guys want to have me back. I hope so. If not, Chris, you'll tell me later that man, I was just rubbish. So
no question there, Steve. We'd love to have you back.
Yeah, I'd love to be here.
Cool. Well, thanks.
Awesome. Thanks all.